All right, so it's been a little bit since we've done a video on the numbers, mainly because over the last 3 to 4 to 5 weeks, there have not been any major changes to report as far as the daily fluctuations of the numbers. However, as of this past week, I do feel like there have been some changes that are worthwhile talking about. Hence, I'm doing this video. A couple of basic data points to note before we start talking about the numbers. The first thing is incubation of the SARS-CoV-2 is anywhere from 1 to 3 days. Most people get symptoms within 7 days. And people, when they die from it, typically most are going to die within 19 days. I know there's variation with that. Incubation might be as long as 14 days, but for the vast majority of people, after exposure within 7 days, you'll have symptoms, and within 19 days, you'll die if you're going to be one of those numbers. So when I look at these trends, you don't necessarily look at day-to-day fluctuations like the stock market. You want to look at the general trends. And so that's the reason I've held off doing any videos because there have not been any major trends. So what I want to do is go through numbers, go through countries, go through areas in the world, and then come in the United States and go through states and just talk about what I'm seeing, some thoughts on explanation of numbers and what that means for us today and going forward in school in the fall, what that might mean for us in the United States. So I do want to start with China, just because look at this, China. Daily new cases. China has not had any cases in months. And if you look at daily deaths, China has not had deaths in months. The reason I'm showing this to you from the Worldometer, which is where this is from, is mainly to show a point that the data is only good as the input. If there's no data being input and it's not being input accurately, it's kind of useless. The point of this is that in the United States, we're doing things a little bit haphazardly. Some states are reporting different than other states. Some states, if you have a positive test, they'll do a repeat test and to verify that you have the disease. And if it's positive, you'll have 2 positive tests. Some states are doing presumptive positives, where if they test someone the positive, everybody in the house the family is considered positive. So there's a lot of disparity in the numbers. So point of this is just to visually show, hey, data in, it's kind of what you get. I think overall numbers in the United States are reliable and dependable, but until we kind of figure out a unified way to report the data, we're going to have some ongoing questions and controversies about it. Now, Italy, what we saw was Italy was the first. The coronavirus started in China, came to Europe, started in Italy. So what we saw was by the time they figured out what was going on in Italy, it had already spread rapidly. So we saw within a month from July 27th to March 27th, you had the peak within 4 weeks. So basically that means this hit Italy and went throughout the whole country, basically. But the good thing is, since May, June, July, for almost 3 months, cases have been down. So this is probably run through Italy mostly. They're probably not going to have a peak come fall, winter. Their death rate mirrors that of their infection rate, which is kind of unique as we go through different countries and we talk about the United States. But the basic gist is this is probably gone through Italy. They're probably not going to see a re-peak surge in this. And it's kind of gone through their country. So I'm using this as the paradigm for that. Now, Sweden's interesting in that Sweden never really fully shut down. They only limited access to the elderly. High-risk people they kept out of exposure. And so with their cases, there was, a smoldering of the cases. They were having anywhere from 400 to 500 cases a day. They had a gentle peak in the summertime, and it's come down. The interesting thing with Sweden is their deaths mirror what we saw in Italy. So what they did is they protected the high risk. So the high-risk people got exposed, got it, and we see this gentle trend that looks just like the Italian trend, even though they approached it differently. They only protected basically the high-risk people. Again, cases versus deaths. Now, I want to keep that in mind. Sweden is the paradigm for kind of letting it ride, but not letting the elderly be exposed, wearing masks, and places that are really dense, and leaving up to the people. And fortunately or unfortunately, Sweden did not have a high penetration or penetrance of mask wearing like other countries have had. So the United Kingdom, we trailed the United Kingdom by about 4 to 6 weeks this whole time. So when I was tracking back in March, April, May, and doing these videos back then, I was talking about how the UK was a paradigm for the United States. What's happening first there is probably going to happen to us. So you see their track. They tried to initially do the Sweden thing keep things open, but they very quickly changed their minds and started masking, social distancing, et cetera, closing things down. And yet their curve looks mostly like the Italian curve as well. Their well, what was that? I'm sorry, I was going the wrong direction. Sorry about that. This is their case curve, and that was their death curve. Now, their cases are interesting in that they didn't have this really big peak like they had in Italy. It was this gentle smoldering coming down, but but their deaths did look very similar, suggesting that the elderly, sick, high-risk people got it, and it's kind of burned through the population, and still smoldering there. But we're not seeing with things easing off. We're not seeing a huge uptick in the cases um, in, in, um, in the United Kingdom. And by the way, they are behind us by about 4 to 6 weeks. I'm sorry, they're ahead of us by 4 to 6 weeks. Now, Spain was a wholly different city, wholly different case. I'm sorry, they got hit pretty hard. Things puckered off, but now cases are going back up again. I'm not quite sure how to explain the case uptick. If you look at the numbers of about two to 3,000 cases a day, much less than their 8,000 a day. But I think the ultimate curve you want to look at is not the case, it's the deaths. And when we see the deaths that looks like the Italian curve and it's puckered out. So what that means in Spain is even though more people are getting it now, they're not dying from it. Either because the high-risk people are not going out and being exposed, which actually is the case, mask wearing is being instituted, but also a lot of the vulnerable have already passed away from this illness, unfortunately. So even though they're seeing this uptick right here, a significant uptick from 300, 400 cases a day when it leveled off to just about a tenfold increase, we're seeing absolutely no increase in deaths. And this is important because the question is, will we see that this here in the United States as things pick up, that the case of the incidence of deaths are not picking up? I don't know. Let's see. So United States. Now, one thing about the United States we have to remember is the United States is one country, but it's not a country. It's 50 semi-autonomous zones that have self-governance that share a federal form of government. What that means is that Virginia is governed differently. We're a Commonwealth. We're governed differently than California and Florida. Louisiana has a parish system based on the French history, their history of being a French colony initially. And so each state is totally different. So we look at this curve in the United States and we see an uptick in cases. The big thing becomes, what's the rest of the country look like? What's the state you live in look like? Now, if you look at the actual daily cases, 32,000, 28,000, now we're seeing 70, 60. So we've seen about a doubling, we'll round up a tripling of the cases. So the question in my mind is, what we saw back in April, we're seeing roughly a tripling of the cases in July. Okay, how about deaths? Are we seeing a tripling in the incidence of deaths? And the answer is no, we're not. So actually, the number of deaths from about 2,400 back in April came down to about 600, and now has gone up to about 12,400, 1,400. So we're seeing a doubling in deaths from our low, but still the overall deaths are much lower than they were before, even though we're actually seeing now an uptick in cases. We're having way more cases now than we have in the beginning, but not more deaths. So the point here is though cases are going up, deaths actually are staying down. And this is exactly what we want to see. We want to see more people get it, which is what that graph depicts, but not more people dying from it. So the question is, what does the state where you live look like? Does it reflect this increased incidence, but lower relative death rate? I don't know. Let's go through some states and treat them like countries and compare with other countries. And that's what I'm going to do. So let's start with New York. New York is our Italy. Basically, as this virus came from China to Europe, it mutated into a different strain that spread more easily, but was also less lethal. It came from Europe to the East Coast to New York and spread very quickly. One of the things that New York city proper did not do when cases were initially there, they actually were sending some of the older people back to nursing homes. So they're actually facilitating the spread among the elderly. So you'd expect to see a high death rate on the front end of things. They also did not shut down the subway system for quite some time. So it was literally just spreading throughout the major population center of New York and the surrounding area. So it pretty much, it was as if they didn't do a whole lot just because of the way the dynamics of one of the biggest population centers in the world. And that's not a political statement. It's just New York is a very special city. There's only one New York. There's only one London. So it just was, just the way it was. But then the question becomes deaths. And this is the important thing. New York is past this pretty much. If you look at this, they had a ton of deaths in the front end, and they're having a few, just a trickle now. If you look at the deaths per their cases, the cases have been pretty stable, but the deaths are pretty low. So some of the data suggests that up to 50% of people in certain boroughs in New York City proper actually have already had this. So New York may already have hit their herd immunity. Going to be hard to know. They were having it raging in the wintertime when people were, or the fall, when people aren't quite out all the time. Now people are out and about, and it's not really picking up. It's relative out and about, I know, because of social distancing. California, California was interesting because on the front end of things, they did not have an uptick in cases. Different state, different geographic location, different environment. Back in March timeframe, New York is a pretty, I'm sorry, uh, California is a pretty moderate environment. So it wasn't until summertime came around, after the 4th of July, you start to see the cases in New York go up. And if you look at the relative increase, you're looking at 1,600 cases a day to 8,000, 10,000. So maybe an 8 to 10-fold increase in cases. Okay, so the bigger question is not cases, but it's deaths. And here we see this deaths have been relatively stable, and this is quite intriguing. 82 deaths, 98 deaths a day, now maybe 135. So not quite a doubling. If you want to do the math, 92 to 120, so maybe a 50% increase from that time frame, while the numbers are increasing by magnitudes from, again, tenfold. So what we're seeing is a significant, huge increase in cases, but in relationship to the increase in cases, a diminution or a decrease in deaths. So even though the death absolute is up a little bit in relation to the cases, it's low. And this is exactly what we want to see. We want to see people getting it and not dying from it, relatively speaking. The other thing about the New York about California we see is their curve has been pretty flat. People are going to get this. So if they'd been like New York and been on the front end, they would look like New York now. And that's where, the question at the beginning of this was we do the swing thing? Do we get through the pain quickly and work through it? Or do we kind of slow the process down? So this is a great graph of how we've slowed this whole process of spread down so that our hospitals could adjust, we could flatten the curve, we would not have our system overrun, we could develop new therapies. And actually, this has worked because as more people are getting it, more people aren't really, now a lot more people are dying. So actually, the time we bought to figure out new management, new therapies, dexamethasone, interferon beta, all these different things, how we can lie people, how not to intubate them, it's actually made a difference in how people are being treated, and people are doing better. So let's go to a different state. Let's go to Florida. Okay, Florida is an interesting case study because it's the oldest, as far as age of a population, has the oldest, biggest group of old people in the country. Yet on the front end of this, not a lot of people were getting it. It wasn't until summertime came around and it got hot and everybody goes inside their air conditioning houses, it was my personal experience when I lived down there in the summertime. Everybody pretty much hid indoors, and you're seeing the cases explode. So again, let's do the little kind of basic math. 1,400 cases a day. Now we're seeing 11,000. So 8, 9-fold. Forgive me if my math is not 100% accurate. I'm kind of winging it, but roughly 8 to 9-fold increase in the cases. What do the deaths look like? Okay, we do see an increase in the deaths, but relatively 61 cases to 256. So we're seeing a 3 to 4-fold increase in the deaths. So we're not seeing the same level of increase in deaths as we are in cases. And this is exactly what we want to see. Well, why is that? Well, is it because the older people are being kept away from the younger people so they don't get sick? Is it because of the new therapies we have? Is it because now we know more about face mask wearing and social distancing? Kind of hard to know. This was not the experience of Italy or New York as far as on the front end, but now we're kind of being able to use their experience to minimize deaths in these areas that are actually having a slow exposure. And this is what we expect to see. Ultimately, as we get back out and get exposures, people have to get it. This curve right here has to ultimately, as far as cases, the area of the curve for New York and for Sweden and for Italy has to ultimately all be the same, whether you crunch it into 1 month or 2 months, or if you spread it out over half a year, 3/4 a year. Ultimately, all the lines, as far as their volume, have to equal the same relative to the population. Texas, very similar to Florida, not a whole lot in the front end. Now we're seeing a lot of cases in the back end. Do the little thing, 1,400 cases a day. Now we're seeing 9,000, 10,000. So maybe an eightfold increase in cases. Um, what's the relative increase in deaths? If you look at, 56, 30, 56 a day. So now about fourfold increase in deaths. So you're seeing, again, the death incidence is increasing, but relatively cases, it's a slower increase. Tenfold increase in cases, fourfold increase in deaths. It gives you sixfold. Why aren't those sixfold? Why aren't we seeing a tenfold increase in cases, tenfold increase in deaths? Because we are masked and we are wearing social distancing. We have new therapies that if you get sick, we can treat you early. We can have preventive things like the vitamin D and the NAC and the things we've been talking about for 3 or 4 months that tons of people are taking now. We have a new way to treat you if your oxygen level is low. We've got new biologics. So much has changed in the 6 months that's allowed us to treat this better. Virginia. Now, Virginia is a very moderate environment. It's where I live. If you look at the cases in Virginia, our system was never overrun medically. We did a pretty good job of keeping our systems going, looking at 800, 900 cases a day. And now we're having, 900. So really, if you look at the number of cases, we do have some spikes here, but the actual cases, had a little dip, but it hasn't really been anything kind of crazy. If you look at the deaths, again, it looks like there's more deaths. If you kind of look at this whole general feel for this curve, there's more on the front end, less on this side. We're a little peak here, but ultimately we're not seeing a huge amount of fluctuation between cases and deaths. And again, if you look at this curve for Virginia, we're spreading things out, and that's what flattening the curve does. It flattens it out. The expectation is, the flatter you make it, the longer it takes to play out. If you peak on the front end, like New York, it burns out quickly. If you do like California, slow it out, it's going to take longer. We're kind of in between the two of those where it's here, it's kind of festering, but no crazy uptick in deaths. And that's the most important data point, is not who gets this, but who dies from this. Because half of all people who get this have no symptoms. If you're a kid or a young adult and you get this, 80% of people have no symptoms. So the reality is we have to get this to save or protect the older. Now let's look at a couple other states that are different, more extreme weather in the wintertime and more moderate in the summertime. Jersey. Okay, New Jersey looks very much like New York in their instance and their death, very much like New York as well. So it probably went through Jersey very similar to as it went through New York. If you look at a little moderate state like North Carolina, well, their cases in the front were kind of low. It looks like a hybrid between like Texas and California and Florida, but cases kind of trending up as almost in a line. You see like almost a nice line kind of coming up here. But then the question is, do we see, if you're having 400 cases a day and now we're seeing 2,000, which is roughly a fivefold increase in cases, are we seeing a fivefold increase in deaths? And the answer is, it's roughly, maybe a gentle incline right here, but roughly the same. So again, more people are getting it and not more people, at least in North Carolina, are dying from it, which is exactly what we want to see. We want young, healthy people to get this. We want low-risk people to get it. We want older, sicker people not to get it, to be protected, like my parents, like my mother and father-in-law, like other people I know, and you want to prevent them from getting it. Massachusetts, interesting. Their cases will peak. They did a little more gentle on the front end of things. People don't talk about Boston's a big metropolitan center, but you look at the daily cases, it's come down daily, so it's kind of come up and come down, and it looks more like the New York curve. Interesting, there were some homeless shelters in the Boston area that are having on the front end 25, 30, 40% of people there already having this back in March-ish timeframe. So this curve for Massachusetts, which is actually very moderate, beautiful this time of year. People are out doing stuff. I have some patients that are actually, I was doing video calls with this past week. People are doing their part, wearing their masks. We're not seeing crazy uptick. So Louisiana, another moderate state on the front end, peaked, came down. Now it's going back up on cases. But if you look at the deaths, it's kind of sort of mirrors the cases for them. I think the point is that we're not seeing, a huge uptick with deaths, with the cases going up, which is what you'd expect if the high-risk people are being protected, if people are social distancing and wearing masks, which does not 100% prevent you from getting this. It just decreases the amount of virus you get exposed to, so your degree of illness is not quite as bad. There's some interesting studies looking at mask wearing. You still get antibodies but you just don't get as sick, you know. So that's kind of my summary review. I know the numbers are being reported on a daily basis, which makes things a little difficult because, you know, you have a spike on Monday and a spike on Wednesday, and a spike on Friday. You only report the spikes. All you hear about is the spikes. So hopefully this gives people a little better view of what's going on. Um, I think my point is this is what we expected. If you flatten the curve in New York, you know, if you flatten this curve, the result is you lengthen it. So if you take the New York, we basically took the New York curve, and we're let me find Virginia, like Virginia. We're turning it into this is the Virginia curve. So we're basically we're just prolonging the process. We're lowering the total amounts and prolonging the process. Probably we'll see this continue once school starts and kids start going back in some areas. In the Richmond area, it depends on what school you go to, but enough kids will be going out that we'll probably see a little spike in the fall. People should not be alarmed. It's just part of this whole thing. Until we get a vaccine, we need to be vigilant, or until this burns out, whichever comes first. And it looks like in some parts of the country, like New York, it may have already burned out, and some other northeastern states and other places like Texas and California and Florida did a good job of stopping the spread on the front end, but now they're on the back end having to deal with that, what that looks like. But overall, even though more people are getting it, relatively more people are not dying from as a percentage of those who have been infected. So if this was helpful, please share it with friends. I've learned that unless if you don't click on it and like it, if you don't share it, if you don't comment on it, it actually on the algorithms for social media, it's not really spread. So if this is helpful, please like it. Please hit the little bell thing. Please add a comment, and that will just help this disseminate this information to more people. Y'all take care, and we'll talk to you soon.